air travel is not what it used to be. So Anita's been waiting in the airport because of a little bit of rain today, but she's here and we're really happy to have her. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce her tonight, Anita Berrizbeitia, a landscape architect, educator, and undoubtedly one of the most important writers of landscape architectural criticism today. A native of Caracas, Venezuela, she studied architecture at the Universidad Simón Bolívar, received a BA from Wellesley College and an MLA from Harvard. Berrizbeitia is currently Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches design studios and seminars on landscape theory and criticism. Her seminar, Landscape Architectural Culture Since 1969, focuses on the significant transformations in landscape discourse during the last 3 decades. Her studios investigate innovative approaches to our conceptualization of the public sphere in urban sites. And most recently, she has initiated a series of studios that focus on the intersection of urbanism, globalization, and local cultural conditions in the contemporary Latin American metropolis. Her work has been published in the journal A+U, in the books Daniel Urban Kiley, The Early Gardens, Recovering Landscape, and Roberta Burley Marks, Landscapes Reflected, all by Princeton Architectural Press. I've had the pleasure of working with Anita on her contributions to 2 edited volumes on parks, one Case Downsview Park, Toronto, and one Large Parks that is due out this summer. She's also author, and you saw this on her posters, with the architect Linda Pollak of the book InsideOutside, Between Architecture and Landscape, and of Roberta Burley Marks in Caracas, Park del Este, 1956 through 61. She is also a recent fellow of the American Academy of Rome, where she spent last year, where she researched the relationships between the villa and larger territorial and ecological systems. And I've named just a few. I'm doing a brief introduction to sort of make up for some time of the work that she's producing and continues to produce. But I want to just tell you a little story. Last night in my seminar, which is called Large Parks, that a lot of you here tonight are in, the students and I discussed her essay called The Amsterdam Bos, the Modern Public Park, and the Construction of Collective Experience, where it was argued that the park, and this one built in 1929, was a site of production, a park whose appearance was grounded on the work it did rather than other aesthetic concerns of the time. And not only did her sort of lucid insights and provocative writing spawn one of the better conversations we've had with the students this semester, rereading this essay underscores what I always find myself thinking when I finish reading something that Anita has written, how important the project of recovering landscape architecture's own history and disciplinarity is, and perhaps more importantly, how she offers ways of thinking about this body of work through innovative frameworks. On a personal note, I had the pleasure of having Anita as a colleague over the past 10 years, ever since she beat me out of a job at Penn. And we're very happy to have her here, so please welcome Anita Berrizbeitia.
Like that? Yes. Thank you, Julia. That's very nice. I always wonder why they didn't give you the job. It has been a pleasure to be your colleague all these years. I'm going to divide this lecture in 2 parts. Julia said, talk about your work and what you do, but I have my fingers on many pies, and I think that would not make for a very good lecture. So I decided I would divide it into 2 pieces. One is about my work in Latin America. I am interested in understanding and disseminating certain aspects of its design culture. And the second part has to do with landscape architecture here in the so-called advanced societies of the post-industrial world. You might have noticed that the things that I have done more or less get split in that way. There's really no complicated reason for that other than the fact that I am from two places, and that I have really in my career tried to make connections between the two and bridges between the two. I think there is a lot to learn from certain frameworks that have evolved out of Latin American culture that are applicable, especially now, to America and Europe. And my teaching and writing are fundamentally intertwined, and so I will, basically you'll see the connections here tonight. I will begin with the studios I teach in Latin America and how I've transferred the things that I initially wrote about, that with the Boss Park Landscape as a Productive Agency, to treat the topic of informal settlements or extra-legal settlements, as they're called, squatter settlements. As you probably know, this type of settlement is ubiquitous in all of Latin American cities, and they give us a great case study for understanding how important landscape is as matrix for survival. Barrios, as they're called there, emerged as a result of a radical shift in the economic base of Latin America, and in the case of Venezuela, from agriculture to oil, starting during the 1920s. As the new economy replaced rather than complement the old agricultural one, cities that were the new centers of production, meaning the new administrative center for the new economy, were transformed almost overnight into metropolitan areas characterized by unprecedented physical growth, rampant development, and uncontrolled migrations from the rural areas into these barrio settlements. The barrio is a type of settlement that is informal, unplanned, uncontrolled, and ubiquitous. Barrios typically emerge on sites that are unstable, too steep, or on floodplains. In other words, sites that are vulnerable to excessive damage from earthquakes, landslides, or flooding. Although densely populated, they do not have any of the services that the formal city enjoys. There are no paved roads, no garbage collection, sewer systems, water supplies, or public spaces. The environmental conditions in barrios are precarious at best, unhealthy and dangerous in the majority of cases. Barrio dwellers are typically unaware of and disengaged from the land they live on. However, from the point of view of landscape as a medium that deals with unstable and fluid situations, barrios are a compelling subject. Barrios constitute the most extensive and dynamic form of spatial occupation on the planet. Beginning from structures that are extremely precarious and provisional, the house plot unit evolves in a continual process of change and upgrading. Ranchos are rebuilt and gardens planted as economic conditions improve. Likewise, barrio dwellers often migrate, moving between rural and urban areas, responding to cycles of employment of different modes of production, continuously transforming the social composition of the settlement. Eventually, the settlements become permanent and consolidated, evolving towards fairly stable social environments where residents feel a strong sense of place and belonging, and where there are well-established and formalized networks of relations between barrio dwellers and local authorities. The proposition that extralegal settlements be accepted as part of the conventional city and that their informal economies are related to institutionalized practices and their processes has been controversial and slow to gain acceptance. The conventional view from the developed world is that the international poor are destitute beggars and starving children. But as Hernando de Soto argues in The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else, while this may be so, it is not the entire picture. In the non-Western world, he argues, barrios represent a significant portion of the economy. By his calculations, the total value of real estate held but not legally owned by the poor of the Third World and former communist nations is at least $9.3 trillion. In addition, within barrios, there are extensive and also extra-legal economic networks in the form of real estate transactions street-side cottage industries and home-based micro-businesses that manufacture everything from food to clothing to machinery. Moreover, as he and Saskia Sassen suggest, that, quote, the sources for the informalization of various activities are to be found in the formal city's economy. The informal economy is not the result of immigrant survival strategies, but the outcome of structural patterns or transformations in the larger economy. Workers and firms respond to the opportunities contained in these patterns and transformations, and we know that from the experience in this country with migrations from Central America. The problem, De Soto argues, is that because these houses are built illegally and their businesses are unregistered, people's resources are commercially and financially invisible. Assets are not organized, property is not represented as capital, and therefore not useful to start larger ventures and participate in the formal capitalist economy. Giving barrio dwellers legal title to their land, he argues, would promote the economic development of this immense sector of society by enabling them to represent their property as capital, obtain mortgages, and participate more effectively in the formal economy. In our studio, we approached the environmental problem of the barrio by extending De Soto's argument to landscape itself. If barrio dwellers are encouraged to improve their dwellings for economic return, could this have a beneficial impact on the landscape, on the environment? It is not difficult to see, especially in the more consolidated barrios outside Caracas, that individuals who have had to provide for their own housing and urban environment have built space and maintained that space for decades, if not the duration of their lives. How can we organize the circulation, drainage, vegetation in order to facilitate the integration of the formal and the informal city? How can landscape become both agent of integration and resource of capital? How do we engage the dynamic nature of barrio culture to build landscape and to foster a culture of landscape? How do we mitigate the impacts of the environmental cycles of rain and drought without fixing the fluid spatial, economic, and social organization of the barrio? The following proposals are for the rehabilitation of a barrio called Arcadia. It is about 4 hours east of Caracas. It is a 112-hectare barrio of about 2,000 families and 5,000 people. What I'm going to show you, the two proposals. One is the images kept Xing out on the PowerPoint, so I don't have. They must have been large files, so it's not as well documented here as the other one. But these proposals have three things in common. First, following De Soto, they are heavily dependent on the notion that barrio dwellers, as tenacious entrepreneurs, are part of the solution. The proposals focus on the design of fine-scale, localized infrastructural interventions that do not depend on external, publicly funded labor. They also identify opportunities for entrepreneurial activities that relate to the improvement of services in the barrio. Second, they conceptualize conventional technologies such as circulation, ecology, or the management of water, trash, planting, and others in the broadest possible terms, so that they operate at multiple levels, that is, as functional elements in the conventional sense and as social space. And finally, they reformulate categories of public and private space to better fit the prevalent and established patterns of occupation of barrio space. Settlement, let's see, how does this work? Okay, so this is the barrio. This is, unlike the ones in Caracas, this is a new barrio. It's not consolidated. The density of the consolidated barrios, for instance, outside Caracas is phenomenal. Literally, there is no space left between the buildings. But here, the problem with this barrio was that it was located on very flat terrain with very heavy clay soils and no discernible drainage. It is located on an old, on the delta of an old, of the Annapori River, which is prone to flooding during the May-November rainy season. So the objective of our project was to reconceptualize the urban structure of the barrio through the introduction of an effective surface drainage system on the site. However, we began the studio understanding that we were not going to pipe the water underground. There are simply just not the funds or the interest to do this kind of conventional infrastructure investment in these kinds of settlements, but that we would collect the water before it hits the ground and think about infrastructure in different ways. So, okay, let's see, where am I? Where's the...
You just hit it. Just right. We'll advance.
Yeah, let's hear it. Oh, there we go. Okay. This proposal, titled Arcadia 2002, concentrates the primary drainage, water collection and storage, and public space along two existing infrastructures that cut through the site and intersect at right angles. On the main avenue Los Tubos, the main avenue Los Tubos is reconceptualized as a wide boulevard, 1.5 kilometers long, covered with a pergola that doubles as a water collection device. Water collected on the roof is stored inside columns made of inexpensive and readily available plastic oil barrels, which there cost about $16 each. They're very cheap and are made of very high grade plastic. They're actually Dutch. Bus stops, recycling, and garbage collection centers occur along the boulevard. The second piece of infrastructure is a channel that crosses through but does not drain the site. It's regraded to drain surface runoff from La Arcadia and to provide irrigation. Along its sides, a citrus orchard and nursery are proposed as food and income source. A secondary, more localized drainage system made by a network of block-sized drainage basins double as unprogrammed public space at the neighborhood scale. A critical piece of the proposal is the allocation of tasks in the phasing plan according to the source of funding and labor. The proposal builds upon the already existing precedent of barrio dwellers employed by the municipality to build projects and maintain the barrio. It also provides opportunity for entrepreneurial activities that relate to the development of services in the barrio as the barrio develops. The majority of interventions in this proposal are at the scale of what they called callapas, projects that can be built by small teams of people in 3 to 4 days. So the technologies that are proposed here to get this barrio drained and the water collected and redistributed for use are projects that can be handled in this way. The additive notion of the labor in small increments would, in fact, build the environment of this barrio. Examples of these entrepreneurial activities are trash collection and management in trash sheds, orchard and nursery development and maintenance, water collection and dispersal, drainage structure cleaning and maintenance, erosion control, planting and management. And these are the oil barrels that get stacked up, the roof that collects the water, and from here the water is distributed throughout the barrio. The second proposal relies almost entirely on personal initiative and engagement of each barrio dweller as a primary agent of change. Instead of inserting a conventional network of drainage channels, the proposal calls for 3 scales of intervention. A fine-scale infrastructure of domestic cisterns to collect water off every rancho roof. A rancho is the housing unit. Of inexpensive infusions of gypsum, mycorrhiza, and compost to improve the soil quality of every lot, and tree planting, 1 per rancho, so approximately 1,800 trees, to basically initiate a reforestation process that would aid in the absorption of water, the buildup of leaf litter and topsoil, and shade for cooling. I did forget to mention that the heat here is almost unbearable. It's extremely oppressive. This part of Venezuela is actually under sea level. Where diffuse household-scale infrastructures alone cannot efficiently handle water flow, a medium-scale system for directing and collecting water is inserted. These infrastructures are hybridized with cooperative enterprises that promote income generation and asset accumulation. The largest of these enterprises, so here you see the beginning of the plantations of the trees and the more diffuse interventions in the drainage inside the barrio, and you see here how it would begin to evolve as the forestry and the drainage evolves. So remaking the ground and then planting. Okay, the social spaces. On a more local scale, nodes for the collection of water in the form of swales or large square concrete storage tanks begin to suggest an alternative to traditional public squares. For instance, leaders of the community might grant time-limited use of these spaces to any collective of 2 or more households per permit for enterprises that depend on water, such as laundry, a precast concrete producer, plant nursery, etc., charging rent to fund civic projects. After a few years, these lands could revert to public control. An interim of semi-private use allows for provisional use of places that would otherwise be blank for the foreseeable future. Finally, the proposal calls for a public space to give locus to an already well-established social and political organization. This space, which brings together 4 of the 5 sectors of the barrio, is intended primarily to facilitate coordination strategies between individual households and for the diffusion of simple technologies and information. Closer to us here in the States, I ran a studio for the Instituto Municipal de Investigación in Juárez y Planeamiento, so Municipal Institute for Research and Planning in Juárez. As you all know, Juárez is one of a series of 14 pairs of twin cities that have emerged on the border of the U.S. Between the Pacific and the Gulf. And these cities are the fastest growing cities in the United States. Ciudad Juárez itself is the oldest and largest city along the Mexican side. It has historically served as the crossing from Ciudad de Mexico towards California. It is the fastest growing city in Mexico with a population of over 1 million inhabitants. The unusual adjacency of a modern industrial first world power with a developing third world country has brought together the advanced capitalist systems of global economies driven by maximization of profit with plentiful low-cost labor producing urban environments where 2 different cultural worlds collide. We began this project by looking at the larger environmental and economic systems at work on the city. And we explained to them their own situation in terms of 5 ecologies following Rainer Bannon's analysis of LA. So there are the ecologies of human migrations. As I said previously, there is massive, and as you know, there are massive migrations, not only from Mexico itself, but through Mexico, from the southern portions of Central America into the United States. And that in itself is hooked into the larger global economy of the maquiladoras in Juárez. There is the ecology of jonque. Jonque is the word that they use in Juarez for junk. And these are the countries that, no surprise here, produce most throwaway stuff in the world, and it all ends up in Juarez. I'm sure you've donated your old clothes to the Vietnam's vet or whoever it is, and this is where it goes. And it's a real part of the economy. The same thing as tires, old cars, crates, you name it. They go to El Paso, they buy the huge flatbed trucks, it comes to Juarez, and that's where all your stuff ends. And it is a real driver, there you go, of the economy, not to mention of the way the landscape is built. And of course, the politics of water are phenomenal in this part of the world. The United States and Mexico are constantly fighting for every single drop of water, each making accusations to the other. And it is a problem that permeates the whole region. I should say that one starting point of this studio, but also the ones in Venezuela, I do, as I mentioned before, I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from this kind of environment, from the point of view of the agency of landscape. And I always tell my students that we do not go there in a kind of, well, sort of Peace Corps mentality, you know, we're Americans, we're gonna do something for them. I always ask them to go to another studio if that's the case. We do really try to design from within, from the social and historical processes of those settlements, and so in the case of Juarez, that was also about not talking about the problems. We know Juarez is ridden with drugs, prostitution, huge social problems. I completely took that out of the studio. It's not that it doesn't matter, but I frankly didn't want it to be the subject. I wanted that ground to be described. And this is the same problem as in Venezuela, a very different economy, a very different place, but the same informal settlement on an undescribed ground. So this is Annapori, and this is one of the settlements west of Juarez, one of the poorest settlements west in Juarez. And I think you may know that the economy of Juarez is based on the maquiladoras. These are, the government gives huge tax breaks to international companies, pharmaceutical companies, and any other, you know, automobile. There's all kinds of factories there, and they employ 15-year-old women who are at the height of their eye-hand coordination. They have very fine motor skills, and they employ them in these factories. And this has caused, you know, big scandals here. And but the truth is that these women migrate into Juarez, and they arrive alone, and they live in these kinds of places. And then they travel every day towards the eastern part of the city where the maquiladoras are, so back and forth, and that's how their life unfolds. So one of the students, and this is Annapori, there you see it, the Chihuahuan Desert. And applying a very similar process as the ones for Arcadia, this student began to generate systems on the site that would work at multiple levels, providing employment opportunities, sources of income, and at the same time building a sense of community, of identity, and solving the kinds of environmental problems of erosion, extreme heat, and so on. And this is using the kinds of desert plantings and economies that are that the West actually preys on in terms of agave and all of these plants that are used to make liquor, and but also for herbaceous medicines were employed here to both begin to grow a landscape literally out of the desert ground, accepting the housing as it is, and becoming the real framework for the future development of this area. There was another beautiful project, also a reforestation project that had a relationship with the formal city itself. Juarez is a very ugly city, also with very huge, very significant environmental problems, not one tree anywhere. And this project, in fact, was a project of urban forestry where the trees were seeded and nurtured in the Barrio settlement and then sold to the city for a reforestation project, thus initiating a symbiotic relationship where the Barrio would be helping the city and vice versa. Several projects took place in the most hated part of town. This is the U.S.-Mexico border. This is the levee that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers helped as a flood control device, but you know very well this is stay out of here kind of flood control device for people. And notice the lights that shine this way, but not that way. And the city has developed away from the levee because it is such a hateful thing that it literally gives its back to the levee. And yet the levee is the primary open space of the city. So several students used ideas of encroachment and invasion of the levee to produce their work. And in here we have an extension of the idea of the productive landscape used for, in fact, ideological reasons. In this case, she started a whole series of plantings on the levee and operations to produce herbaceous medicinal medicines and agave and all kinds of things, but under these tent structures that would catch the wind, ventilate the area, improve working conditions, but of course also hide the people from the authorities on the other side of the border, and really give them a sense that in fact they do not know everything that goes on the other side. And this is where Annapori is, and that's the levee, and here's El Paso, and this is the entire sort of Maquilas area. So she started to intervene all of these zones with her productive pieces, such that they would also then grow back into the city and then reconnect the city to its levee. And this is what the agave workshop looks like, or what kinds of plants they use and what they use them for. It's actually a plant that has multiple uses, and that draws pulls a lot of money around. A lot of the things that a lot of the agave production that is used for manufacturing of Western products, in fact, happens in greenhouses in Canada. So a lot of the students were researching this sort of global network of the production of, from orchids to agave to all of these sort of tropical and desert-like plants and understanding that they're produced in environments where they are not from naturally, where they're kept artificially in tropical conditions in greenhouses, and in fact making proposals for relocating all of that to places like Juarez and the Levee and so on. So these are all the uses for that plant. And this is how she envisions that beginning to infiltrate the city. And encroach on the levee. All right, there it is. And then finally, one of the most provocative projects that happened here, and they loved this one in Juarez also, is titled Reprojecting the Border. And this student wanted to literally change the image internationally of what happens here. And she took the idea of this new zone. There's an existing project proposal for this kind of international zone between El Paso and Juarez, where there would be this dedicated bus line that travels between the two, whereby you do not have to be stopped for an hour and a half to 2 hours at the checkpoint to give them your life story, but that it was a much more free interchange between the two. And she actually came up with this route that this bus would take along the Chamizo Park. This is a really important place in Juarez because this is where the border crossing is, and this is also where the river used to flow back and forth, so that there was a huge border dispute during the 60s that was settled with that levee. And she made that whole area into a movie, an outdoor movie theater, a series of outdoor movie theaters that could be enjoyed by people from the community who would come together here in the context of the film festival that happens in Juarez and throughout the year to share in this event. So this was the basically the programmatic element that guided the shaping of these earth berms that would, can you see that? That would in fact be the outdoor amphitheaters for the projections of these movies, and there are many of these screens, and some of them would be oriented to Juarez and some of them would be oriented to El Paso. And the whole idea that you get to talk back at people that describe you before they know you was an incredibly empowering thing for these students also to understand. So these projects are a shift in paradigm for Barrio rehabilitation. Instead of replacing Barrio with housing, and this is the thing that is different here, barrios are considered to be, traditionally have been considered to be a housing problem. So when the government comes in, they build houses. So we're saying, don't build houses, don't give these problems an architectural solution. We propose to engage social and economic forces already at work to reconceptualize the landscape as capital. As such, the barrio landscape will support the social and economic advance of its dwellers, and it restructures the environmental integrity of the area. In this vision, landscape is not the empty, cleared space of migrant colonization, nor the last layer of a consolidated barrio, but the foundational matrix upon which the future growth and development of the households and the settlement are hinged. The environmental implications of this framework for the thousands of acres of barrio land in Venezuela, in Mexico, in the rest of Latin America are extraordinary. If every household unit can plant a tree, if individuals or groups of them can engage landscape as enterprise, producing and protecting land assets. A new landscape will emerge, spread and persist through time, while ranchos and their migrant dwellers come and go. Do I have more time? Okay. That's one half of my life. So the other one is a lot more sedate, and I'm just realizing that anyhow this might take a lot more time. So I'll move quickly through it. But before moving to something that I'm working on right now, I just wanted to bring up that my work on Borderland Marks really just to because the book is out and you can certainly read it, and I don't have to repeat that here. But what I was trying to do is to construct a framework to interpret Latin American culture and landscape. Colonial societies are very heterogeneous in terms of their built environment. Unlike, say, Europe, you go to Paris, say, and all the parks look more or less the same, or Rome, and they do, or Spain, and so on. When you go to a place like Caracas, these parks sort of, some are in the French style and some are in the kind of more agricultural style, and some, here's Parque del Este in the kind of modernist style. And this is because colonial, post-colonial cultures, before they became, let's say, independent, they received their stimulus, economic stimulus from different, from whoever was investing in the country at that time. So until the Spanish left, we had urban landscapes that were very similar to the Spanish. When the Spanish left, the French paradigm replaced the Spanish, and at that time, Alphonse was doing his thing in Paris, and so because that was a paradigm, there's a whole section of Caracas that reflects that kind of response to sites in the urban landscape. When during the 50s, when Latin America really came of its own, when all of the sort of influences of Europe and the United States were finally pushed to the side, and Latin America really produced a significant body of art, architecture, landscape, music that was less influenced by the first world powers, then you get a very different design sensibility in the cities. And my job here was to really leave aside Western frameworks for discussing Borderland Marks. Every book you'll see basically reduces him to sort of big leaves and orange phallic flowers or whatever. And I was trying to look at the urban history of Caracas and how this park responds to this kind of situation. And rather than saying these things are, you know, bad copies of a better original, and the original, of course, is always in Europe or the US, that by understanding them from within, we could think of different ways to read and interpret these landscapes. I'll leave it at that. And I've just been asked to, this sort of daunting task, to write a chapter on, for the John Dixon Hunt is putting together a 6-volume set of the history of landscape architecture, because it's the 25th anniversary of the Journal of Garden History. And I am to contribute to the volume of the 20th century on design, and I had no idea of, how to even begin to do that, but I am really interested in this question of of form and expression. And I thought that I would track, I would give a reading of the sort of evolution of design in 20th century landscape architecture from the point of view of the notion of the arbitrary and where the arbitrary has changed within the design process. This is a response to current design culture and sensibility, which calls for an emphasis on the design of frameworks rather than forms, on strategic organizations, dynamic infrastructures, open-ended programs, ecological instability, and so on. This focus on the adaptive aspects of landscape, of program, and of space seems to leave aside the question of form, or the role of formal invention as a part of the design process that is critical to its success. It is true that as site analysis gets increasingly complex and technical, formal considerations get deferred towards the end of the design process. Nevertheless, formal choices are unavoidable, and no matter how much we talk around it, those projects that remain meaningful are always formally strong, inventive on many levels, and bear the imprint of the designer. That is, they display design sensitivity that is unique, they display the intuitive, that which cannot be rationalized, in other words, a measure of the arbitrary. But this disdain for purely formal and arbitrary things is not unique to the contemporary culture of landscape. The history of 20th century design tells us that critical design theories, typically generated by practitioners, arise to challenge what were perceived to be conventional forms in the landscape, those that have become standard practice, somehow naturalized, inevitable, and that have ceased to relate to current social conditions. And this is what that would look like if on a list. What were they challenging? Kylie, Rose, Ekbo were challenging the purely compositional approach to landscape architecture, this kind of thing. Until then, this is an image from Hubbard and Kimball's Introduction to the Study of Landscape Design, in which they are primarily concerned with landscape architecture as a fine art, and advocate the objective of design to create the effect of pleasure on the eye of the beholder through unified compositions, completeness of organization, either in a humanized formal style or a naturalized informal style. Macquart criticized a long tradition of works as formal, and he also criticized this kind of sort of brutalist master planning. This is Brasilia, where the hand of man dominates, and he, in fact, derided all of these things, formal things, as question of style that were not important. Halprin criticized all design that did not include social and human criteria, and he mentioned in his criticisms these kinds of things. Versailles, he also mentions Brasilia, and he also mentions Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, and so on. Walker criticized the bland, recessive landscapes of corporate America that by the 70s had become largely based on criteria from the outside. Behavioral sciences, social sciences, engineering, community. In other words, he felt that disciplines that were external to design, to our own internal language, were restricting the autonomy of landscape architecture as a cultural practice that has a discourse that is of its own. Hargraves was criticizing this kind of thing that was ubiquitous in the U.S. American cities in the 70s. And in a really funny article, he derided this as the asymmetrically geometric and the fluid amorphous. This is his reduction of what design was at that time. All of which revolve, quote, around an internal organizational system in an idealized and invented space. True. Almost a decade later, Corner takes on a thorough critique of everything in what he calls the three tyrannies: positivistic, paradigmatic, avant-garde, and he in fact mentions absolutely everybody in the dictionary as bad without really giving a solution to the problem. But what did they solve these criticisms with? They solved it with form. So even though, in fact, they avoided discussing the issue of form directly, but they did propose things that led to specific choices with regards to form. These are some of them. I'll skip through all of this because my intent in this paper is to actually not only discuss how we might interpret the formal and the arbitrary and the inventive, but how has the nature of these things changed during the 20th century and to what end does it serve? What do you... Okay, let me see. Well, okay. So I will begin at the beginning of that list, which is that starting in the 30s and 40s, designers chose from a wide repertory of existing forms that were out there, mainly in architecture and painting. Because these forms are not evolved out of previously existing ones within the discipline, they were perceived as arbitrary by the generation that followed. Ekbo, Kiley, and Rose, in fact, identified the new spatiality of modern architecture as the type that would allow them to solve the problems they were pursuing. And these were how to be more efficient with the use of space, how to be more cost-effective with the price of planting, and how to incorporate issues of environment. James Rose, quote, "When plants are used as specimens rather than mass, fewer plants are required for the same control and division of space. This is partly the result of using all sides of the plant instead of only the one side used in massing as a design element," end of quote. This idea, which comes from horticultural practices and new concepts in construction, was paired with the spatiality of modern architecture, specifically Mies van der Rohe. This formal structure proved very productive until past the 1960s. From this kind of work and the huge body of work that emerged out of this kind of spatiality, we learned that, in fact, during this time and even later than that, what matters is the choice that designers make from a wide repertory of existing forms, such that the choice may demonstrate a kind of congruence with a broader agenda of program technology of spatial structure. But the choice remains at best arbitrary, because they could have chosen from a wide spectrum of other things there that could have equally served their purposes. Forms may be arbitrary to cite, pure autonomy of language, but they may not be arbitrary with regards to history. Designers choose to be arbitrary with regards to type so as to produce new languages. So, for instance, Roberto Burle Marx, and this is the plan of the Parque del Este, here chose to hybridize paradigmatic forms and paradigmatic types in order to produce other things. In this case, a park that was a true expression of Latin American culture during that time. And I will give you quickly an example of how he structured this, which is called Los Patios, which is a reference to the courtyard gardens of Spanish colonial times. And this is that space there. This is the entrance to the park, and I will walk you around. He saw this, he envisioned this as a circuit, and he envisioned them as a series of rooms, each of which would have a very different emotional effect on the visitor. And the first room is the cool, watery aqueous room, which is in contrast to where tile predominates as it did in the Spanish courtyard garden that came from the Moorish influence to Latin America through the south of Spain. The second courtyard was meant to be the opposite. Instead of cool, watery environments, he wanted a hot, highly graphic room in which everything here, all the plants, are either blooming white or in variegated leaves, such that they would contrast with this wall that is tiled with about 1 inch bright red tiles. And these are massive walls, by the way. There's nothing sort of gentle about this. As you leave the enclosed courtyards, you come into an open courtyard in which there is a hybrid lawn that functions as a sort of semi-parterre, but also a kind of sitting place for this performance area here. And then you walk around and then back into the front. And what I mean when I say that he is hybridizing types is that he is mixing here the tradition of the Moorish and Spanish courtyard with the English promenade, architectural promenade, say, of the English garden. He does not think of the courtyard as a singular space, but as a hybrid heterogeneous space that requires the person to move around it. In addition, he shifted the spatial qualities of the spatial structure of the space. Water is usually singular and an object in the center. He made it a plane. The same thing with the tiles. He put them on the walls. And instead of walking around the perimeter, you walk in the center, and he displays the perimeter, the water to the perimeter. So these kinds of interventions are, you could say, arbitrary to a certain extent. They have no relationship to the site, and yet they are fully lodged within his spatial sensitivity and in a kind of dialogue with the historical development of landscape culture in Caracas. Pete Walker, the early work, is a very interesting work to re-examine in terms of what I'm trying to explore here with the arbitrary. I will run quickly through this. You all know this work very well, but he said about the Tanner Fountain, quote, "We finally decided that the edge was the thing and that we would have no internal recognizable geometries. You get an ambiguous relationship between the object and the field. We moved the fountain to the edge and let it buzz. The fountain is made of insignificant objects placed in a significant way," end of quote. And what he is trying to do here, not much like Burle Marx in the stylistic sense, but in the discursive sense, he is trying to provide an ambiguous reading between the fountain as object and the landscape as field, or the fountain as field. And by manipulating the program of the fountain from something that you look from a distance to something you can inhabit, something that is very much always an object in the urban environment, right? It is it follows the, say, logic of the monument. Typically, it doesn't care about what it's around it. And he has, in fact, made it engage changes in pavement, has made it accept existing trees, and has made it programmatic. He has welcomed people in it. And the entire project can be seen as this kind of effort to begin to undo conventional notions of what a fountain or an object in the urban environment is. Okay, and here you see the condition of the object field. A huge, a lot of conversation. We're still talking about this kind of hybridity between, you know, what it is to be formally oriented or designing through frameworks or fields. And he seems to really put his finger on this quandary. The same thing with Burnett Park, where he is really opening up the question of what is a plaza versus what is an American green. And by hybridizing the two, by manipulating the forms here, he in fact begins to get very complex readings that change your interpretation of what a plaza and a green are. Of course, Pete Walker was heavily criticized by, because he was being a formalist, and yet I think we need to revisit what that exactly means, because when form, even when arbitrariness has an agenda behind it, then it seeks to be a form for form's sake kind of approach, but in fact pushes design and design culture forward. All right. And what I like about this proposal is that he takes Ian McCart's idea of the layer cake and applies it to the design of a small square in California. But his invention here was, in fact, to make the decision that nothing was going to scale the right way with the layer on top or the layer below. As you know, in an ecological framework, those things are keyed to one another. Geology is keyed to water systems and vegetation. I mean, they do certainly belong to one another. You cannot really split the systems apart. And he is here really manipulating the scale such that there is no relationship between the function, the quantity of the elements, and the size of the elements to make discourse out of normal, everyday, urban artifacts like paths and benches and things like that, lawns and so on. So you've got paths here that don't lead anywhere. Are they lines? Well, is it the old grid of the Spanish colonial settlement? But it's a path, but it isn't. What is it? You know, this kind of very interesting and precise intervention into the language of landscape is here done in the spirit of something that is formal and yet discursive. This is, of course, we're talking about here not modernism, but post-structuralist era, and he is heavily influenced by language and the idea that post-structuralism is really about pulling apart the object and reconstituting the object, putting it together again in very different ways, but using forms that are taken, using forms that are not generated from the site itself, but taken from the outside and brought in. Later on, we see that George Hargreaves developed a language of these braided landforms that don't only come out of language, which is his criticism of his predecessor, but come out of more complex criteria. So it's both language, but it's also hydraulic engineering, ecology. And then he turns all of that around, all of that sort of hyper-rationalization of these things, and then plants those landforms sort of across geographies and climates, and, you know, it sort of Portugal and California and Kentucky and Guadalupe and it doesn't really matter. So that's another attitude towards the arbitrary here. Of course, with Duisburg Nord, we really got the message that there is no connection between form and function, that those things are, everything is in fact adaptable. And one thing that interests me exploring in this paper is that when you hear that things are arbitrary in contemporary design, means that they're not rationalized enough. And yet, I think people forget that forms themselves have a resiliency that nobody wants to admit to. Think, for instance, Versailles, and looking at Paris from the Arc de Triomphe, they are exactly the exact same forms as Baroque planning, 200 years apart, very different programs and scale. But the same form has a resiliency and an adaptability and a precision that people seem to forget that exists. And so they, in fact, delay making formal decisions. I think a lot of what's called landscape urbanism is an absolute total denial of being a designer, and the pushing over of these kinds of decisions for later on. But with this kind of situation, we really get the point that in fact there is a kind of adaptability and resilience to program and form that opened up the whole question of the arbitrary in the late 20th century. Well, Martha Schwartz tells us, give me any form and I'll give you a landscape. Okay? Another attitude we have at the end of the century. And here she takes that and she blows the scale up, changes the material, and in fact, and the program to do something very different with that. And many designers of that generation have that attitude towards form. They literally shop for it and then transform it creatively. They see images that are compelling, that address their personal sensibility, and are able to transform it. But the initial intuitive move is completely arbitrary. Paradoxically, site specificity has been the framework to produce the most, I think, the most arbitrariness and formal invention. And I'm saying this now, and it's obviously a positive thing for me. Georges Descombes really grounds his work on site, and so does Paolo Borghi, so do the earthwork artists, so to speak, and yet none of the work is, you could say, is predictable in any way. Everything is, in fact, further gets another layer of information with the personal sensibility of the designer and with an attitude that is not nostalgic and it's not about blending in. Laurie Olin and Peter Eisenman try very hard to find site where there is no site, and they literally make the site out of very abstract games that they played with folding grids in order to, say, find density within the abstract plane, and then from here use this as a site to then locate housing and park and so on. You see how that results then in that, and that into the looser, less dense framework that was placed there. And I would end by saying that in fact we are at the height of the use of the arbitrary at the moment, because digital technology allows us to produce whatever form you can imagine. And basically it is, we have concepts that come out of the facility that digital technology gives us. This is not digital. This is handmade, but it's very much a gradient. And those forms are literally brought into projects in very loose ways, but also very precise ways that reflect a kind of internal sensibility of the designer. This is my last image, and this is West 8's proposal for the central waterfront in Toronto. And I'd like to end with this image because to me this proposal operates at all levels. It really captures a sequence from pure form to pure framework in the development of the waterfront of Toronto to even pure symbol. And this particular element here is particularly interesting. At first it seems very trite, is the symbol of Canada, but in fact it is this kind of environment, which is an estuary where the Don flows into Lake Ontario, is an environment that wants to make islands. You put something there and an island works around it. And so that this place is actually constantly, shores are being formed outside the city. But this element also has multiple readings. In fact, it is huge and it is an immense wetland. And it is really the size of several blocks in the city. And it is also a marina. This is a boardwalk that and holds actually several pieces of important recreation within it. And so, let me just see, I might need a little bit of light here. To conclude, where I am at this right now is that landscape architects seem to tell us that what matters is the choice that you make from really a repertoire of existing choices that are out there, that what matters also is how you combine given forms, and that those are, no matter how you try to rationalize that at one level, that is a kind of sensibility that becomes really a choice that is really impossible to ground on site analyses or any kind of other objective criteria. The arbitrary appears also in the choice to take a language that a designer develops and then spreads around. And we know that from Frank Gehry to Martha Schwartz to George Hargraves to many, many designers, in fact, evolve a design language that bears their own personal imprint and then it becomes recognizable as one. And at that point, then the contingency of the site becomes, in fact, very much invisible, and the work comes out in all of its formal glory. And I think I will leave it at that, to say that that the strongest works are those that, in fact, continue to be formally deliberate, that resonate with sight, that have social ambition, but that still leave room for the imagination of the designer to unfold. Thank you.
I see some froggy faces.
Yeah, sorry about that. This is really...
Just because it's very late, I don't want to close out the possibility of asking questions, and Anita's kindness said she'd take a few. Do you have any? Just to comment about... Just make it loud. Back to comment about when you said landscape urbanism denies role, denies the role of design. Given that it is such, either general or complex term, discourse, whatever, just in general.
Well, when you see the competition proposals, just to give you a sense of, just to name Fresh Kills, a normal one, right? What is interesting is the scales of representation. You have the airplane view, right? This is nobody calls it that, but that's what it is. Big master plan. Remember the picture of Le Corbusier with the thing? This is what's happening. These projects are being designed from the air, no matter how they call it differently. Let's call it what it is. So you have that scale of the representation, and then you have details of, say, a wetland that doesn't tell you where it begins or where it ends, or what the size of the wall is, or how it's made, or what the real scale as it relates to the body of that is. So you have, these projects are being represented as sort of master planning from the sky and then collage. And there's nothing in between, and that's where the battle happens in design. So to me, those are projects that are much more about land banking. Let's defer the design decisions. And I think they implicitly acknowledge that decisions will need to be made here in the future. And so the question is why is it that it's being sold as high design is very interesting. And I think maybe we have to look deeper beyond the incredibly compelling graphics to see what the work is really doing that's differently, because a lot of information is missing. And I think it's this disparity, and not the disparity, the huge gap in scale in the representation from the bird's eye view, the airplane view, to the immediate that leaves everything out. The other interesting thing about that project specifically is that, at least at the level of at the time of the competition, he tried to make language of it, right? The sort of fingers of forest and the circles, the islands, and the matrix, the island, the whatever. So a kind of post-structuralist sort of language-driven thing. But then when the project was subject to the realities of the ecological consultants, all of that has disappeared. If you see the latest plan for Fresh Kills, it's much more an ecological restoration project at the scale of agriculture almost. Huge plantations of meadows and forests, really at the level of agriculture, that's lost that sort of language-driven instinct and ambition, I would say, of the competition. That's how I know that design is missing, right? Because, yes, the framework is a framework. That's all it is. After that, a lot of things can go wrong or can go right too. But the things that ensure that landscape has a problem of legibility. It can disappear very quickly if you leave it all to the birds, and so I think that is a real critical question still now.